it's through EdSource or AXA or CTA or SEIU or CSEA, a number of pieces that analyze the governor's budget. Before we go into the governor's budget proposal, I will call out just a few key themes that I'm sure Director Akala and Mr. Hillman will touch on as they go through their slide presentation. And Mr. Hillman will be joining us as soon as he gets to his destination. A few key things that I think we need to just remember are, one, that this is the governor's budget proposal. And while it is indicative of where we are as a state financially, it is important to remember that this is his initial proposal, and now the legislative body will wrestle with this, and there'll be a lot of advocacy and discussion and negotiations at the legislative level. And really the next update we get is the May revise. So kind of from now until the May revise, there's going to be a lot happening at the state level, and we expect a lot of advocacy. The good news as an overall theme is that the governor is trying to protect education the best he can. I will say the bad news overall is that what the governor has proposed is far different than what school districts across the state adopted as a budget in June, and that includes Fremont Unified. So we'll go over some of those direct implications for us and what they mean for us locally as we go through the presentation. And with that, Director Akala, if you want to begin the presentation, if you can share that on your screen, and then we'll kind of dive into the questions and answers after your presentation.
Sure, sounds good. Let me just see if I could share my screen, everyone. Let's see. Oh,
let me make an adjustment real quick.
Gotcha.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? This is Danny.
Yes, we can hear you, Danny. Thank you.
Great. I can't get my video to turn on, so you'll get to see the presentation anyway. You don't want to look at me, so it's fine. As Superintendent Kamek mentioned, this is the presentation that I was able to review with the Board of Education back on January 17th. And so I'll be going through the slides again, but I won't spend as much time on certain things. And I can always dive into other things more deeply if this body has questions or would like clarifications. There's a little bit an opportunity to be more interactive, which I think is nice. So why don't we go to the next slide? This was the agenda that we went over at the board meeting, the budget themes, why the state economy matters so much to education funding. We looked at revenue projections, specifically the governor's and the LAO, or the Legislative Analyst's Office, the differences between those two, why that was important, how that affects Prop 98 and local control funding formula funding, and then funding for any new and existing programs from the governor, and then next steps in the overall process, which Superintendent Kamek has already outlined a little bit. So if we go to the next slide. The main themes from the governor's budget this time around was essentially there's a state shortfall due to tax collections coming in lower. That's largely due to the fact that the tax collection deadline was pushed from April all the way until October of 2023. So the state had to pass a budget to meet their constitutional deadline of June 30th without really knowing all the information that they know now. And so they made some spending decisions, assuming that revenues would come in higher. That didn't happen. And so the governor's budget essentially is trying to show and make up for that revenue shortfall. Some of the other themes, really as it relates to education funding, is that his proposal is protecting education funding, trying to make the education profession more attractive by taking some red tape out of the way, incentivizing people to enter the profession. And then the governor's focus is still on students whose learning was and continues to be deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And bottom line is really that the governor's budget is using a more optimistic revenue assumption than the LAO. And that optimism that he's showing is really shows, it comes out in the numbers and shows that he believes they'll be able to continue doing most of the programs that he has been a champion of, including rolling out transitional kindergarten and a lot of the mental health initiatives and things that he has initiated as governor. His budget proposal really maintains most of that. So on the next slide, this gets into the details a little bit about what he's projecting. Third or fourth bullet down, almost a $38 billion budget deficit for the 24-25 year. That's next year. He is projecting this to basically fill the void. He wants to tap into the public school system stabilization account, the PSSA. That's basically the rainy day fund for Prop 98. And one major difference from previous governor's proposals, May revises and adopted budgets, is that economists were responding to those proposals and budgets by saying, "Hey, keep an eye out for a recession. That if that happens, things could change drastically for California." But most economists now are not forecasting a recession. They believe that growth is fairly strong in the economy, especially in California. It's strangely strong. They expected it to go downward at some point through the last 12 months, and it didn't do that. And I believe since the governor's budget came out, or pardon me, his proposal came out on January 10th, national United States GDP was actually came in, I think, at 3.3% growth for the last quarter. So the economy is showing strong signs of growth, and the projections are going to predict continued growth, but smaller rates, like 1%. It's going to be really slow and small according to their assumptions. Next slide. This really was just a slide trying to highlight a little bit more detail about the economic forecast from the UCLA Anderson report that comes out. It's one of the best California economic forecast reports. It's used by state agencies and the governor and the LAO and others. And so here are some of the details that they're talking about. I mentioned the slow economic growth. Inflation is continuing to decline, but still there. Interest rate cuts are predicted at some point in the 2024 year, hopefully. The Federal Reserve seems to be signaling that. Of course, it all depends on how inflation continues to come in, whether or not those rate cuts happen. Rate cuts are good for the economy. They spur investment and other things and spending. And then, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the national economy is defying historical recession indicators. There's been a couple of data points that have pointed to a recession. I won't get into the weeds, but basically that recession didn't come to pass. And so that's puzzling some economists. On the next slide, you can see that we were trying to re-explain. I try to do this as often as I can in case we get new audience members who don't understand why the economic cycle is so important to understand for school finance. And basically, it goes like this. In California, we have a very progressive tax system. And that progressive tax system, you pay more taxes as your income goes up. Those tax revenues, sales tax, income tax, and corporate tax drive the majority of the money that the state of California gets. And that's the state's the green box, the state general fund spending. It comes from those big three taxes. Approximately 40% of the state's general fund by formula is assigned to Prop 98. And Proposition 98 is the California Constitution amendment that basically designates by formula how much money TK to 14 education gets every year. That's community colleges and public schools. And then which money individual school districts get is determined by something called local control funding formula. So on the next slide, we've got the piggy bank that just talks about the three taxes, the big three, as I mentioned. And then these are the dollar amounts on the right-hand side that the governor's proposal is saying they're projecting that we'll get in personal income tax, sales tax, and corporate tax. On the next slide, we were talking about progressive tax system within personal income tax. The lion's share of that comes from capital gains, which is what the tax that's collected when people sell investments. And so when the stock market does well, state of California does well. A lot of our money comes from people who invest, especially the highest earners in California. So if they have a good year on their stock portfolios or their investments, the state of California tax returns go up. On the next slide, This was just a comparison over time of basically the enacted budget is the blue bar. That was last June. And this is trying to show the difference in the assumptions and how much money the state thought it would receive in June versus the LAO fiscal outlook, the orange box, which was December, and then the governor's budget proposal that came out in January, which is the green. So you can see this change from blue to orange to green, the changing assumptions around personal income tax, corporate tax, and sales and use tax. It's pretty drastic in a couple of areas. And you can see that in the out years, 24, 25, the governor's projections are pretty optimistic, is the word I think people are using. On the next slide, this was basically just showing the difference in Prop 98, and because of the lack of tax revenues at the state level, how they were going to recalculate Prop 98. And so you can see it's a $9 billion drop from the enacted budget. This is the two bars on the right, on the left hand side, 107 billion down to 98 billion. Again, the governor is saying he wants to fill that by using the rainy day account. But we'll see how it all fleshes out at the end, because Prop 98 sets the floor for school funding. So if it was going to be 107 billion, and that was true, then next year would be at least that or a little bit more. But since they've recalculated it down to 98 billion, that now becomes the floor. So this is something we watch because we want to make sure that we know what to expect. And if they're basically changing the floor by 9 billion, that doesn't bode well in the long run for schools, because the floor just got lower than what we were told in June. It changed very quickly from the month of June to the month of January, 6-month time period. On the next slide, we did discuss a little bit the difference in outlook between the governor and the LAO. This has to do with their assumptions. I won't get into it here, but basically we're just trying to highlight again the optimism in the governor's budget and how he's expecting things to come in a positive way to help him balance the budget. In the next slide, we talked a little bit about this change in the Prop 98 guarantee, and it becomes important again to track, not only so we can expect what's coming, but also if the governor decides that 107 billion and the new floor by calculation is 98 billion, they get to decide, the legislature and the governor, about what happens to this $8 billion that schools have already received. What do they call it? And so do they call it an advance or you've already paid you this money, so they don't want to take it back, or they do want to take it back? So the negotiation process that Superintendent Kamick mentioned between now and the May revise in the month of May will be very important to watch, because whatever the state designates this extra money that we've already received, all districts across the state, not just Fremont, will become a very important part of our potential advocacy within the educational community. We don't want the state to say, well, that 8 billion is just, we're going to call that an advance. And so next year, we don't owe you anything else. We already gave it to you, so you guys have to work that out at the local level. That would be what we don't want. What we would rather have is, on the accounting side of things, they call this $8 billion in funding something other than a local control funding formula allocation. They call it extra, above and beyond, and then school districts determined how they wanted to use that at their discretion. That would be the best case scenario for school districts. So this is just a slide outlining the fact that we need to keep an eye on this, because it may trigger some of our advocacy. Slide 13 was just highlighting some of the things not in his budget at this point, but that doesn't mean it couldn't come into his next proposal in the May revise. But there are no cuts to Prop 98. There are no deferrals, meaning, well, it's an IOU, we'll owe you later, and no sweeps. Last year, the governor's proposal did suggest a sweep of money that was either had already been distributed, and some sweeps of things that had yet to be distributed, but they kind of made a promise and then they were going to pull it back. None of these three things are in his proposal from January 10th, and that's a good thing for education, and we hope that continues and that doesn't change too much between now and May. On slide 14, This was highlighting the fact that the state is deficit spending. They're basically spending more than Prop 98 is bringing in by the calculation. And again, they're using the rainy day fund to basically keep programs whole within K-14, TK-14 education. Again, something we want to keep an eye on. You know, the state always tells school districts you shouldn't deficit spend for a long period of time because it spends down your one-time dollars, which is true. But it's interesting that that's what they're doing. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one. On the next slide, this was a more detailed narrative about the risks to Proposition 98 based upon that deficit spending. And I won't regurgitate it here, but basically, I think the one thing that I would highlight is just the COLA item in the bottom left corner, that the governor's 24-25 COLA, he's saying that he can fund the entire calculated COLA 0.76% at this point. But that assumes, his assumption is that there won't be an increase in costs between now and the next 6 months. And I think most economists are looking at that and saying that's unlikely. We'll probably have some cost fluctuation, so that COLA might get recalculated. But at this point, unless the governor were to do something else, there's no real extra money to fund more than a 0.76 COLA at this moment, unless they make other decisions, which is, of course, totally possible and all part of the negotiations process between the legislature and the governor. On the next slide, we just gave a summary of what the 0.76 COLA does to our base funding. You can see how it changes the grade level amounts that we would get per student, TK to 3. A little over $9,900 is what it is this year. It would add about $75 and bring it up to close to $9,994. And you can see how it changes. The COLA is very small, and so the dollar amounts that get added are very small. On the next slide, we tried to talk about the COLA and just remind people that the COLA is not a decision by any agency or person. That the COLA is a calculation. It takes into consideration and into account different economic factors, primarily the price of goods for governments. It's like a consumer price index, but for governments. And so the decision comes in about whether the government has enough money to fund the COLA, but the percentage of the COLA is not an opinion. It is a calculation. You can see here at the bottom basically how it changed. In June of 2023, when the state adopted their budget, the assumption at the time was that next year's COLA would be close to 4%, 3.94. And then the next year after that, 3.29, and then the year after that, 3.19. So to change from 3.94% down to below 1% is a pretty drastic change. And I think it's the next slide, or the 2 slides, if you go to it, James, we show what that kind of means for Fremont in a second. Right before we leave, just generally the COLA conversation, this is a historical tracker of the COLAs over the last 40 years. And you can see that 6 and 8% COLAs, really anything above 5%, above 6% is pretty out of the norm. The majority of COLAs historically have been, anywhere from 1 to 3 to 4%. And so the last couple of years, we've experienced some pretty high COLAs. And that's because the calculation came back that prices were going up really high, really fast. And so the calculation reflected that. The state had enough money to fund the COLA, and education and our partners, everyone benefited from that across the state. On slide 19, we basically try to show this in numerical form. We don't receive percents, we receive dollars. And so in the 23-24 school year, the year we're in right now, the funded COLA from the state was 8.22%. That yielded for Fremont Unified $388.5 million in local control funding formula revenue. And that was paid on 32,500 students. Those are our numbers for the current year. In 24-25, a 0.76 COLA is going to generate $381 million. And so if you do the math here between 388 and 381, that's a loss of money for us. And the main reason it's a loss of money is because we're expecting fewer students. And I think everyone on this call knows we get paid for the number of students that we have. So if we had had, for instance, 32,500 kids this year, and then we had the same amount next year, we would get a little bit of a bump. But with the loss of students combined with a small COLA, the district will be starting next year, 24-25, with $7 million less than we did this year. So it's just the way the numbers work out. We would have to have something like a 3% COLA in order to, for next year, or pardon me, yeah, for next year, in order to really break even. The math on this, if you're interested in doing it, play the at-home game on this, is a 0.25% COLA is about $1 million for Fremont this year or next year, 24-25. So you can see if you were to do 0.25 and start adding that up, if you were trying to get rid of $7 million, you would need it to be, somewhere around 3%. And then we'd be at zero, which means we would have the same amount of dollars this year going into next year, 388 million. That's not what we're projecting. So on the next slide, I think we show it graphically. This is trying to show the difference in COLA really affected our cash that we're expecting to get. In June is the blue line. Those were our assumptions. An 8.22% COLA going to 3.94, then the year after that, 3.26. Instead, we go from 8.22 down to 0.76. You see what it does to the cash. It's the same slide from before, just shown graphically. 388.5 million now goes down to 381.4, and then we'll see a little bit of a bump if the COLA in 25-26 comes out that way, 2.73. But you can see, even if that number happens, we're still at $386 million. So we still wouldn't be back to the level of funding we got in this year, and that's 2 years from now. So because of declining enrollment, it has kind of a corrosive effect on the revenues that districts receive. And unfortunately, that's just the negative thing about declining enrollment. Fewer kids, less money. And if you hit an economic downturn along the way, it just means things get harder. On the next slide, we talked about next steps. Superintendent Kamek already kind of went through this, but basically between now and May, more economic data comes in. Tax day will come, of course, and hopefully Californians will pay their taxes on time to give a good indication to the state government about how much money people made and how much money they owe the state. And that will allow the legislature and the governor to continue their talks about their priorities and the different things that they'd like to fund in the next years. It's worth remembering that while the governor's proposal doesn't have any cuts to education, his overall state budget does have cuts. And so there will be this push and pull effect between the governor and the legislature around their priorities, the things that they care about, and those will include education. So you may see proposals from some legislators that say, well, we want to decrease education funding a little bit because we don't want to do a big cut to the court system or the prison system or roads and all the other priorities that we have in our state. So I wouldn't be surprised by headlines going back and forth as they go through those negotiations and they have their different ideas and they try to talk about it between now and May. So that's pretty much I'd say the broad brushstrokes of what's going on with the governor's proposal. I think at that point, the rest of the slides are somewhat self-explanatory. A lot of them are just for reference. And so I'll go ahead and turn it back to Superintendent Kamek and any questions or anything we want to dive into.
Thanks so much, Danny. I think when we take a look at that, we see that, we are in a better place than we were the last time we had an economic crash because the state didn't have a stabilization account. So in that sense, it's very helpful. I think for me, there's a dichotomy here where we see a lot of headlines that say, school funding is being protected. But when you look at a district which is in declining enrollment, which is nearly every district in the state, and then you look at the adopted budget in June and the current projections for COLA, you start to see that even though we're quote unquote being protected, most districts are dealing with the same situation we are, where there's going to be a significant loss of funding and a significant impact. So it's a little bit of parallel path there. And I want to open it up for questions, comments from the group. I think, we need to recognize this as a place that it is likely that budget adjustments or reductions will need to happen in the future. But as we outlined in our first interim, we have, I think, established a good fiscal foundation. And we think we can, finish this year. We think if things hold, we can get through most of next year, but short of significant new funding or changes from the state, we will need to make some adjustments with this news. And that it is a very practical reality that we will need to be considering budget reductions in the future. So that's something to be mindful of as we move forward. And that's not said to offer fear, but it is to kind of make things a practical reality for us, that this has changed the financial picture quite a bit. So with that, we'll open it up for questions from the group or comments. Trustee Jones.
Yeah, I think the more I am, when this was presented to the board, it was very, very fresh. And the more I've read, the more concerned I'm getting that we're going to see this look a little worse in May. Because I think that the legislature is going to have to balance what they're seeing from the governor versus the LAO. And there's going to be a lot of advocacy going on with other interests in the state not to cut them. And our legislators are going to get a lot of pressure to cut into education, at least a little bit. And a little bit for us is a lot. And, I'm concerned about where we're seeing increasing costs. And I think I mentioned this at the board meeting, but we're projecting STRS and PERS costs to go up about 6% when you combine them. Special ed into the general fund, that contribution up 1%. The SRO MOU has a 5-year bump built into it. Utilities up about 10%. And I think just to deal with step and column increases aside from any sort of settlements we make during negotiations, that's 1.5%. And those are all increases. And I am concerned with what I'm seeing. I don't know if there's anything to make me feel better about what we're looking at, or like I said, at the board meeting, I spent my first 3 years on the board making really significant budget cuts. And I still remember what was on those cut lists, and we're down to really painful things. I mean, we were in the last round, and I don't know what this is going to look like for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up good points, Trustee Jones. I think that, your areas of concern are the areas of concern that are shared by all. I don't think there's anything necessarily that's going to make anybody feel better. I think one question that comes up is, why don't we plan for more things like this? And I would say that, we in the state of California have a funding model for our schools where we can only go based on the best information we have at the moment. So we're required to adopt a 3-year budget. We do that with the best information that we have available to us. But we really only have, the most recent information available from the year prior, and the closest projection is the current year. So we are in a little bit of a difficult position as a school district, which all districts are in, especially as Mr. Hillman showed the graph where we look at what we adopted as a June budget for projected revenue and how far that leaves us from where we would be with a 0.78 COLA in the governor's budget proposal. If there is some silver lining in these clouds, it is that I think we really worked on our deficit spending the last 3 years. We got it down, I think, at budget adoption to around $2 or $3 million, which is a lot better than where we've been the last 5 to 7 years historically. And we were mindful of our reserves and how we spent our one-time money. And so that is, I think, if there's a silver lining, it's buying us a little bit more time than other districts have. Many districts that I spoke to this week when I was at the state superintendent's conference are preparing to enact budget reductions of a significant nature right now. So I think the good thing that we've done is we have a little more runway than other districts. But as I said, you know, there is the practical reality that we're going to have to make reductions. And I am in a similar boat to yours. This is my 8th year as superintendent. I think 6 of them between 2 districts have involved budget reductions. So it is a challenge that we face. And just so the group knows, when we get to that phase and process, as we did in my first year here, we will engage this group in deep discussion around those. But we'll also be mindful of the fact that, you know, nearly 80 to 85% of our budget is people. And so when we start talking about reductions, it impacts programs and people. And we'll also be very sensitive to the fact that you are here as a member of a group that you represent, whether it's our employee groups or our parent groups. And so we're going to be mindful of that as well and how we engage in conversation. So that will be something that we do together, but I think those concerns are very real, Trustee Jones. With that, we'll go to Rocio and then to Michelle.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just saying thank you for the presentation, Mr. Hillman. And I'll say regarding PTA, we have the opportunity last week to have a legislation conference, and Jokes and Benita were there. And I will say we have the opportunity to meet with some of the legislators and also with some of the staff for legislators from regarding Freeman and also Alameda County. And we also let them know about all these things that we talk about about the budget, about the COLA, about teacher rotation, transportation, wellness, mental health, and et cetera, right? So for what I will say as a PTA representative, I will say I was planning to do an activity to inform and educate more the parents the first week after spring break. As a Freeman, I know Alameda, and I'm helping out with that with to Benita Verma as well. We're planning to do in March, inviting students and parents to advocate for each of these causes. And some of the legislators are happy to come and also and talk about it to make the community aware. So that I think as a PTA, Mr. CJ, I will say we will advocate and we'll continue educating as far as parents and the students from middle and high school. So there will be the voices there, and then also we can talk with the legislators or send the letters that you request before you mentioned before in a couple of the school board meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that information, and thanks for the advocacy. We'll go to Michelle, then Ganesh, and then Yokes.
Hi, thank you. Very good presentation. A couple questions that came up though in my head. I know last year we went through the same thing and we had it was a projected decline in enrollment. I want to say it was around 350 students, and that I think we ended up with something like only a decline of 60. I know we always kind of go with the worst case scenario because we don't want to be like the governor being that optimistic, but in judging this, do we have a clearer sense of what our decline in enrollment truly is? Is it because, and also is it because students are leaving to go to online courses, or are they actually moving out of the area? Do we know that?
Good questions, Michelle. So a couple things about declining enrollment that I think are important to note, and Mr. Hillman can jump in after I finish to add some additional insight for things that I might have missed. In terms of why our students are leaving, I think it's really the same as it would be across the state. Are we going to see a small percentage of students that would move out of our schools by choice without moving residents to pick another schooling option? I think that's possible, but I don't think that's a high number contributing to a significant decline in enrollment. Really what we're seeing is the decline in birth rates is what's impacting enrollment across the state in the biggest fashion, and that's going to be true for us as well. We are generating new housing in Fremont, but that housing generation is not generating the student population that we would typically see, in part because the new housing is a little bit more dense, and that densely populated multifamily housing has a much lower student generation rate than single family homes. And so our neighborhoods don't turn over quite as much as they have historically. And some of that is related to the economic conditions, because it's not a time necessarily where people can sell their home and go get a lot more for the price that they've sold it for, even though it might be worth a lot more than they purchased it for. That's kind of what we know about our overall enrollment in trends. I think it's a little too early to know definitively what our declining enrollment pattern will be, because we've had a few elements that impact that greatly. One being the pandemic. We obviously saw an increase in the decline when families may have moved out of the area because they were able to work more remotely. We'll have to see if that changes, as many companies are moving to more of an in-person work model. The other piece that we change is the extended day kindergarten enrollment, and that program may have impacted our projected decline. We may have been able to capture more students than we have historically. What we do is we take our actual enrollment numbers and we roll them up 1 year. And then we also give a comparison metric to what our demographer report shows. And so we look at those two things and try and come up with the best projection we can. The one other thing that impacts this number, and Mr. Hillman might be able to clarify this a little bit more, is the state put in new provisions during the pandemic where you could use either the highest of your last 2 years of enrollment or a 3-year rolling average. The 3-year rolling average was different, but helpful for most districts that were in declining enrollment, because it created more of a gradual downward slope than a cliff. But what happens with that 3-year average is we had a significant decline in enrollment a few years back, over 1,000 students. And so in the last 2 years, we were kind of protected from that loss. As we roll forward into the next budget cycle, we'll see the full impact of those students in our calculation. So that is contributing to what we're calculating in terms of a decline in revenue based on our overall enrollment number that we get to use for funding. Mr. Hillman, any other information on the funding piece there?
No, you nailed it. I wanted to make sure people knew about the 3-year average, the rolling average, and that 1 year, that the last year of high enrollment that we had right before the pandemic is now rolling off, and we're rolling in a new 3rd year, and that's affecting the number of kids that we are. It's not the number of kids we are expecting to have as much as what they're going to pay us on. So yes, that's the thing, is it's the 2019-2020 school year where the district's enrollment was higher is rolling off, and now we have 3 years of during the pandemic and post-pandemic enrollment. That's kind of notching everything down, and that's what we get paid on.
And so that's, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, just to follow up to make sure that I'm understanding. So if we go with that model, or we have to, and just for ducks, let's say it's 32,000 students is what it was, but we actually see an increase. Are we only going to get paid on that 32,000? We're not going to get paid on the higher amount of kids if it goes that way this year or next year?
We get paid on the highest of any of the 3 options. So let's just say we were at 32,000 kids right now, and we jump to 35,000 kids next year. We get to say 35,000 kids, they'll pay us on that. So
Okay.
you get the highest of the current year's kids, if last year's kids were higher, or now you can use the 3-year average. So we calculate all 3, and it automatically selects the highest one. So we're maximizing and getting the most money possible from the state by choosing one of those 3 avenues.
Okay, thank you.
And one thing I'll say before we go to Ganesh on the enrollment pieces, we've talked, I think, in this group about the state's model for funding based on average daily attendance versus enrollment. And I think there's some appetite at the state level for funding based on enrollment, not ADA. But the key factor there is, if the state were to do that today, some districts would lose money because if the state does that and they don't increase the size of the money that they're allocating to school districts, it's really just a redistribution of existing funding. So, when we talk at the state level about funding by enrollment, it really needs to also be incorporated with increasing the size of the pie. So that's an important consideration. And one piece of advocacy that some individuals are starting to talk about right now at the state level is to say, giving districts 1 more year of protection from that declining enrollment would be a one-time cost for the state and may be very beneficial to districts. But we haven't seen a real appetite for that yet. So with that, we'll go to Ganesh and then Yokes.
Thanks, Superintendent. Thanks for the presentation and the information. As always, it was very informative. It's disheartening to see, of course, that we are constantly struggling with budgets, and I don't have suggestions or ideas, but I just have a few comments. The first was, it was interesting you pointed out at the start as the disconnect between the headlines and what is reality. And that seems like a comment on those who are writing the headlines, like the journalists who are capturing probably pretty much the direct narrative that's coming from the governor's office, maybe. And I wonder if there is any possibility to influence that narrative as it's being put out. No idea, but it just feels like lazy work at this point in time if they're not really getting the story right. The second comment I was going to have, and I've had my thoughts together and I seem to have forgotten them. Can come back to it. There was another thing I was going to say was around the narrative at the top, where we look at the historical data and our narrative, and I've kind of mentioned this once before as well. Our narrative is that as the stock market does better and the top percentile of people do better, our schools do better. I think that is a fact driven by the data, but the narrative there is really about the inequality in the state. If the incomes are saturated at the top and concentrated at the top, it's really coming from that inequality. If we had better distribution of incomes, more salaries rather than profits, you would see a different effect. And I just kind of like wanted to point that out as well. I had a third thing in my mind. I'll come back to that later. I'll go on with it now. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you. And I appreciate those points. In terms of influencing the narrative, we don't have too much control over that. I would just always encourage people to be mindful of where you're reading your information. I personally think if you want to look at information on the state budget, the Legislative Analyst's Office is always a good place, even though I don't necessarily consider them a media reporting agency. I also would suggest that people look at EdSource. EdSource generally does some pretty accurate reporting. And I think that that's a good source to look at in terms of challenging the narrative at the state level. There's recently an article from EdSource that kind of challenges the governor's budget proposal a little bit to say, how is this really working? But as you bring up, the narrative points are important because the way Prop 98 works for school funding, they have to give us at minimum 40% of the state budget. And so even in a good year, what we hear is we spent more than ever on school funding. Well, if you're required to by the state constitution, I don't think you're really going above and beyond. So it's a unique aspect of those things. We'll go to Yokes and then we'll come back to Ganesh for the third topic.
Thank you for the presentation and for sharing information with all of us. My question was specifically about what deferral means to UCs and CSUs. I know that as part of the budget proposal, there is going to be some deferral to the CSU and UC payrolls. I think there was a promised 5% funding increase every year until 2026 for UCs. With this deferral, what does it mean? Does it mean that we would not be able to increase the local students in the college? How is it going to impact, and what does deferral actually mean?
Yeah, that's a good question, Yokes. I don't actually have information on the UC-CSU system because what we look at in the governor's budget is what we call the TK through 14 sector. And that's really what Prop 98 governs, which covers through basically TK through community college level. The funding for CSUs and UCs is a little bit different. In terms of deferrals, I think the easiest way to think about that, and Mr. Hillman or Mr. Akala can help me, but I generally look at that at the state level as an IOU. They're saying, we are going to promise to give you this money, but we're not going to give it to you when we promised. And so that's kind of the net impact of that. So when we look at addressing our budgets, if we have a deferral, we're not going to count that money in our revenue because we don't think we're going to get it until much later. So those are kind of the things that we generally look at there.
Okay, thanks. I was concerned because it will directly impact the high schoolers who are out for next year, right? So that's why I wanted to check.
Yeah.
It's the wrong forum to ask that question, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
you're
second
correct.
one I had. Oh,
No, go ahead.
oh, please go ahead.
I was
No,
just
no,
going to say,
please go
you're
ahead.
correct.
You were going to say
It will certainly impact our high school students that are leaving for those schools. I just don't have enough information to speak accurately about that.
Okay, thanks. And the next question is not related to today's agenda. Probably, if it's possible for me to request an agenda for future where we get to know about Prop 28 and the plans for our school district. Is it even relevant to this group?
Sure, we can put an agenda on a future item about Prop 28 and we can kind of clarify what our funding amounts are and what the regulations are behind it. Some of our schools have already put forward plans that the board has approved for initial expenditures, but we can put together a future agenda item on that. Let me make a note to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, Ganesh?
Yeah, thank you. I was just, it was just going to be another comment I brought up the federal side of things in the past, and I remember watching the Senate debate for the senator for California. And it was really disappointing to not see education funding come up at all in that, and sort of highlights how little someone who's running for senator for California, like when the topics are being brought up for debate, it just didn't seem like the education issue in California or funding for it was even one of the topics that came there, unless I missed it. It was just a comment from my side that it seems like we need to be pushing more for highlighting this.
Yeah, I think we do need to continue our federal advocacy for so many reasons. The funding being a key part of it, but also the legislation that's behind some of the assessment mandates that we have as well. So we'll continue to work on that, and I'll have to go back and look at that debate because if it was, generally our state elected officials from the Bay Area have been in broad support of school funding, but they haven't had traction with some of their colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So we'll continue to work on that. Trustee Jones?
Just speaking of the situation with the federal government and the other side of the aisle, if folks are not familiar with Project 2025, I suggest you Google it and take a look at what I'm going to say the other side is proposing for education if the election goes a certain way at the federal level. The proposals for education are to essentially gut and eliminate the Department of Education, foist off some of the current responsibilities of the Department of Education to other departments, but really to cut it, if you look at it deeply, within a couple of years, federal money to education is over. So that's kind of what our California legislators are dealing with when they're trying to work with their colleagues, is a mindset that the federal government really shouldn't be involved in public education at all. And it's hard to overcome when you need votes.
Thank you, Trustee Jones. So with that, we have just a few minutes left to review topics for future agendas. I do have the request for Prop 28. And certainly I think that would be a helpful discussion for us because it has been a real area of confusion for a lot of people in education circles and parents, guardians, and community members. There's a unique aspect to that in that it was a piece of, it was an initiative placed on the ballot by the community, not by the legislature. And so there were some unique aspects of, once that was passed, then getting all the regulations in place. And we still don't actually, to this date, have the audit guidelines from the state. So we can review that unless we've gotten them in the last few days, but I haven't heard that they've actually been released, but definitely will be a good topic for us. Are there any other topics for future agendas that the group would like to throw out? Okay. Yes, Yokes, go ahead.
I had brought this up, I think, in one of the earlier meetings. It's about having one common center, performing center. I don't know if that would tie up as a separate agenda item or whether that will also come under Prop 28. I'm not sure. We don't have a community shared performance center for all the schools in Fremont today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we can add that to our list of future agenda topics. Thank you. Trustee Zhang?
Yeah, I have a question. So on that, the 28, Proposition 28, and certain schools have different classes. So I want to know, what is the procedure for different school to offer different classes? Do they get the school survey to see those classes are in demand? And also I'd like to see, let's see the enrollment of those classes so that we can put the best use of those funds.
So I can add that to our list and add a little bit of narrative to it. Let me just make a couple notes here. Okay. So just so people know, for Prop 28, what is unique about that is the money is allocated to each school site directly. And it's allocated based on a formula that includes the site's total enrollment plus some amount of dollars based on their unduplicated count. And so the funding will vary from site to site. And what is also very unique about Prop 28 is that the decision-making authority for the expenditure of those dollars lies at the school site level, not the district level. So each school site has to go through the process of making a decision. Most of them are using their school site council for that process. In terms of what courses they select, it might be a little bit different from each site, but that will be something that we can gather as information. And for the schools that have implemented a second semester course, hopefully we'll have some enrollment data by then to see what the enrollment is for those school sites that have added a course for the spring semester. All right, well, thank you, group. We are going to finish just a few minutes early. We have a few of us who are going to jump on our 5 o'clock board budget subcommittee call. I appreciate you being here and for asking great questions and providing some feedback for the group. I look forward to seeing you all soon. I hope you have a great rest of the week and try and enjoy some of the sunshine before the rain comes back. And if you're a Niners fan, I'm happy for you. As a lifelong Raiders fan, I'm perpetually disappointed. We'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.